And let's record this just in case any of y'all forget this. So like I was saying, we want you folks to start thinking about your career, getting ready for when you graduate, and you're going to have to, apply places. So this is something we're going to be doing for a few weeks. I want to say it's weeks 4 through 9. We're going to have pretty much the same schedule every week. I guess this summarizes it here, but it doesn't really go into too much depth. It's going to look kind of similar every day. I'm going to have you update your LinkedIn profile in very specific ways so that over the course of 4 weeks, it's going to actually be complete and thorough, impressive. But also, we're going to have some behavioral questions that we want you to think about week after week. It's kind of an important part of interviewing is not just the technical part, but these behavioral questions. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about a time when you dealt with a difficult coworker, sometime you persevered and overcame adversity or whatever. These are very open-ended questions, but you're going to get asked the same questions over and over and over as you're interviewing. So we want you to, have a prepared, rehearsed answer that you've thought about and can recite back confidently. So we're going to kind of be workshopping those questions throughout the week. And then potentially also there will be some whiteboarding in the evenings. I believe we have some other mentors who are going to be coming in, some guests coming in from outside, helping you with some whiteboarding to get you more comfortable with working in like an interview whiteboarding kind of environment with strangers who will be quizzing you on these kinds of algorithms. So like I said, week 4 now, we're starting career prep, focus mostly on getting your LinkedIn profile, up to date and everything. I don't know how many of you have LinkedIn profiles so far, but it's really important that all of you get your profile set up, get it looking professional. First step, most important thing is to get a good looking profile picture. We can all only aspire to be as handsome as this fellow over here. Got a nice shirt on, good haircut, smiling. He looks like someone that I would want to employ. So I think that's a pretty good LinkedIn profile picture. Remember, this is different from Facebook or Instagram. You're not trying to impress people with your hobbies or look cool. Just be simple, clean, and concise, smiling, ready to work. Another important part of your LinkedIn profile is your headline. So I know a lot of people, they're not very confident in themselves, and they'll put like aspiring full stack engineer or software engineering student, apprentice, or something like that. But this is not the place for that. For your headline on LinkedIn, this is really more like marketing. This is how you want to sell yourself. So you should be clear, concise, and confident. So even if you've never actually held a job with this title, if this is what you're going for, this is what you're applying for, this is what you should put as your headline. And I would recommend that everybody use this exact phrasing, full stack software engineer, because it sounds technical as opposed to like, web developer is kind of the same job, but it sounds a little bit softer, a little bit fuzzier. You want to emphasize that, you can do hard things, you can solve hard problems, a little bit of computer science. So I think full stack software engineer is a good headline, good title for you all to be using. And of course, feel free to ask questions in the middle of this, although I expect a lot of this will be kind of basic or review for a lot of you. So if we just breeze through it, that's cool too. Don't forget to put your location on your LinkedIn. A lot of recruiters will just kind of spam anyone who knows how to code within like a 50-mile radius of them. So if you put your location down on your LinkedIn, you'll get a lot more attention just from any company that's in your area. So it's an important thing to not forget. Past experiences are very important to have on your LinkedIn. Makes you, seem like more of a complete person. Like a lot of these past experiences at this point aren't going to be directly related to software because you probably, just got out of the military and you're trying to transition into this career. But it still shows that, you have other interests, you have other skills. Maybe in a past life, you worked with finance, you might be well suited for a financial technology company. I've had a lot of students in the past work with geographical information systems, GIS. And so there's a lot of jobs writing code dealing with geographical coordinates and things in physical 3D space in the world. So it's good to show your past experience, just so it shows that you haven't been unemployed, I guess, for the past decade, and you know how to accomplish things, even if it's not directly related to software. Kat, do you have a question?
Yeah, just for Code Platoon, would you suggest putting that under education for us or under experience?
I would probably put that under education. I guess the line I draw is, are you paying to be there, or is someone paying you to be there? But somebody might disagree with me about that. I think you can make arguments for putting in either place, and probably our career services counselors here might be able to give you a better opinion. I saw some other hands go up.
Yes, just a quick question for the location. Is it desired to put where you're trying to look for jobs or where you like physically resident?
That's a good question. I would say, honestly, set your location to where you're looking for jobs, because really, like, all the location does on your LinkedIn profile is recruiters in that area will send you job ads. So if that's the area where you want to see job ads for, I would set that location as your location, even though it's not exactly like honest in a sense, because you don't live there currently. But if you just put your current location, you're going to get approached by recruiters asking you to do jobs in a place that you're trying to leave, in a place where you don't want to work. So my recommendation would be to set your location to be where you're trying to find jobs in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So another thing about your past experience here, in my opinion, I think it's pretty important that your past experience mirrors what's on your resume. Now, you might think that that's kind of redundant, like why write the same thing twice? But I think it's comforting for me when I interview people to see the consistency, to see that like they're the same person on their LinkedIn as on their resume. Because a lot of people will like tailor their resume to the individual jobs, and I don't know how much they're just like telling me what I want to hear. But if the resume that I get personally from them in the interview is the same as what they put publicly on the internet, then I feel a little more confident that like this person is being honest and genuine. This is the same way they always present themselves as a developer, at least. Also, I would say that when I'm reading someone's resume, if there are major discrepancies between their resume and what they have on their LinkedIn, they have the dates are wrong, or they just omitted a job from their LinkedIn on their resume, I'm going to assume either, they're embarrassed about one of the jobs that they had, which is why they left it out from one place or the other, or that they're, trying to misrepresent their experience. But either way, I consider it a pretty big red flag if there are discrepancies between what's on your LinkedIn and what's on your resume. So I would encourage you to fill out your LinkedIn work experience pretty faithfully, at least to the same extent that you have on your resume. Of course, at some point when you get further in your career, you're not going to put every job on your resume. Like, if you bagged groceries when you were 16, at some point, you're not going to put that on your resume. But just make sure that your LinkedIn and your resume match. Would be my recommendation there. All right, so here's a more specific breakdown of what we're doing here day by day, but regards to the behavioral interview question. So this is going to follow kind of a similar pattern over these 4 weeks, but just with different questions. So the question for this week, we're starting simple, is just tell me about yourself. Today, so since we had President's Day this week, these days all get shifted forward. So let's actually change this real quick. Okay, sorry about that. So today we're mostly focused on just getting your LinkedIn set up, but think a little bit about this question. Tell me about yourself. On Wednesday, we're going to ask you to get a little bit deeper into this. Just try to think about, how would you answer this naturally? Don't think about it too academically. Write it down so you've got, some record, some script of how you would answer the question that you can workshop. Thursday, we want you to try to distill this down to its essence. So summarize this in bullet points so you can explain it a little bit more concisely, actually get to the important part without meandering around your story. And then on Friday, we're going to pair you up and have you practice answering these questions with each other. So like I was saying, the question that we want you to answer first is, tell me about yourself. There's a very good chance that you're going to be asked this question in like every interview you do. So I'd recommend that you have a good answer prepared. Now, all of you are different, unique individuals, but there is one similarity in all of your experiences, that you have this military background. So I would recommend working that into your story somehow, because it's probably an important and impressive part of your background. So particular, be sure to mention the branch you served in, what you did while you were there, and most importantly, how you used technology while you were there, and any observations you have about, how the technology changed in your time there. And then, why do you want to pursue technology as you're leaving the military? So like I mentioned before, we're also going to have you do some whiteboarding challenges. So I know we've already been doing a lot of algorithmic problem solving. So it's good that we're preparing you in that regard. But these whiteboarding challenges are supposed to prepare you more for like the format of working with an interviewer who's asking you questions live, being able to explain your thought process while you're coding, those kinds of skills. It's more of like a performance skill in a way than a technical skill. So we've got some basic guidelines here for you about, how you should perform, how you should behave while whiteboarding. Make sure you repeat the question back to the interviewer, just so you're both on the same page. They know that you understand the question. Sorry. Now, most whiteboarding algorithms are going to be in the form of write a function that takes some specific input and then returns some specific output. So make sure that you understand the question in those terms. Probably want to repeat it back to the interviewer in that way, like, okay, I'm going to write a function that takes XYZ in and it returns ABC. You're going to have to ask questions about, the inputs and the outputs. These are probably the most obvious questions to ask first, about the inputs and the outputs. Try in high level to explain your approach to problem solving. You're going to use recursion or iteration, lots of sub-functions, maybe object-oriented programming is your primary approach. It's hard to talk line by line, character by character about everything you're doing, but as much as you can, you should try to explain your thought process so your interviewer can predict the next line of code that you're going to write. And then in that line of thinking, you should probably start out with a little bit of pseudo code, or at least just planning out in some comments the general steps you want to take. So again, this helps the interviewer predict what your next line of code is going to be, helps them follow along with you. Then actually code it, and then maybe write up a few basic tests for it, just some assertions. If I call it with this value, I'm expecting this output. But moreover, you'd have to probably explain how you would test it more thoroughly, like if you were given more time, or if this was a real world application or something, because your time on these whiteboarding assessments will be brief generally. Generally, you should always be talking. Interviewers get nervous if you go silent. Even if you solve the problem perfectly, it's a little bit nerve-wracking when you're completely quiet. So try to be chatty, a little bit more extroverted than you might naturally be as a programmer. Porfi, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, how can you ask for help like during a coding interview in a way that won't just like completely disqualify you from this position?
So I would say, first of all, that if you get the problem wrong, just like completely wrong, that probably disqualifies you from the position. So if you're concerned that you're just not going to get the problem at all, like, don't be too shy about asking for help, because them like, dinging you a point or two on asking for help is certainly much better than just getting the problem wrong because you didn't ask for help. That being said, there is a certain delicate and tactful way you can ask for help. You can often, I would say, start by asking for what kind of help you can ask for. Like, can I search Google? Can I treat you as Google and ask you the kinds of questions I would search for on the internet? Can I consult official documentation? You might just, sometimes depending on the context of the interview, like if they ask you to do the interview in a language that you're not very familiar with, like if you're primarily a JavaScript developer, but you're like, I've written Python a few times. They're like, okay, let's see you do this problem in Python. It might be fair for you to ask the interviewer, like, okay, I know how to reverse an array in JavaScript, but is there a method that does that in Python? Just like list.reverse or reverse and you pass in a list. It's maybe one of the two. I'm not sure how to do that in Python. And then they might clarify like, oh yeah, you call reverse and then pass in the list and it returns a new list. Because like that way, the way that you explain what you're asking for conveys to the interviewer that you know how to code. You just kind of don't know the syntax in this language that you're using right now. So I guess do as much to convey that you know something while still asking for help. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Honestly, sometimes I like asking for help for simple things just because it shows how I would ask for help, and that like when I get stuck, I'm easy to work with and easy to teach. So like even if you're able to complete the whole problem or you think you can, sometimes it's not bad just to have a conversation with the interviewer just so they think you're easy to talk with. So I wouldn't like necessarily, ding someone, think less of them on an interview because they asked a good question, clarifying expectations or whatever. Do we have any other questions about the career prep before we start some HTML, CSS review and learn some new concepts? Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. Let's take a break. Been going at this for a little while. Let's come back at 9:10, and then we'll maybe briefly review one of the exercises from last night. Maybe somebody here wants to show off their HTML page that they made. All right, so yeah, come back at 9:10. All right, so let's get started then. Kat, do you want to just present really quick what you found out, what you learned? I don't know if you need to share your screen or.
Yeah, can I ask a quick question? Are you guys going to post the career prep Google Slides at some point?
I certainly can do that after this lecture.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I'll share my screen. I love HTML and CSS, so this is going to be a great week for me. This is just wait, let me see. I think I'm sharing the wrong thing with you guys. Hold on. Okay. So this is my site. I did 4 HTML things. The first I think is really cool is the details and summary tags. This is kind of a way where you can use JavaScript without needing to, it's not JavaScript, but it basically functions like JavaScript, where you can kind of like show information and hide it. So it's a pretty cool feature, and I think it's new in HTML5. Semantic tags. This is something that I think is really important that I used to not really do when I was first starting out with using HTML. I was using like a lot of divs, and divs are great because they can help you style the page by chunking information, but they don't really give any information to like screen readers about what the function or what purpose that element is. And so it just makes your site more accessible if you use semantic tags like section or nav, footer, header, and things like that, instead of just calling everything a div. And it's also better for your search engine optimization. The picture tag is a really cool feature too. It's instead of using an image, you can use picture, and then you can put in like multiple sources and different pictures that will show up based on your user's device resolution. So I think that's really cool. Alt attribute on image is another important thing that's part of accessibility and SEO. You want to make sure to give a lot of descriptive information about your images so that in case someone's not able to see them, whether they have like a visual impairment or the screen just doesn't load, they still get information about what the picture would be of. And then for my CSS, I like to style the links. I think that's just a fun and like very easy way to make your site look a little bit better. So like there's an average link, there's like a styled link. Multicolor backgrounds are one of my favorite things as well. I have a link to an article and then I used it on my portfolio. There's like a ton of background properties. I think there's 9 in all. So I talked about that. CSS also has like custom properties or variables now, which is, Raphael was kind of talking about this with Sass, but now even regular CSS, you can do that. So you can set like a color, for example, under a variable name, and then you can use it throughout like all of your style sheets. And that's pretty cool because that means that like if I wanted to change the link colors on here, I'd have to only change it in one spot versus like in every single link. Text stroke is something that was new to me this weekend when I was researching this. I used it like up here. It's actually not, so I just put it on here since it was new to me. It's not actually supported by CSS3 yet, but if you put WebKit in front of it, it is supported by all the major browsers. So I think it's like you're taking a little bit of a risk if you use something like that, because if someone's using something that's not a major browser, it might not work for them. But and then I did CSS Transitions, which I think I used here. So it's just, yeah, these are kind of some of the things that I think are really cool with CSS, and I'm like someone who really loves CSS. So that's it.
Very cool. I have some questions about this. Could you actually leave your screen up for a minute? But also I think Grant had his hand up.
Yes. This is for Raphael. Would you say this is a significantly above average site for the level we're at, or is this where we should be?
Like Cat's top 10 website, just in terms of the styling and aesthetics of it.
Yeah, in general knowledge. Mine does not look exactly like this, so.
I mean, I think in theory, if you read all of the HTML and CSS material that we had assigned from yesterday and remembered everything that you read, you would know enough to produce something that looks like this. But I would totally understand if like, you know, you just need more practice to get all the margins and borders looking good. I mean, also, we haven't formally taught you CSS yet. So maybe after tomorrow, I'll expect you to be able to build stuff like this. Why does this look like really slick to you?
For HTML and CSS, yes.
I mean, I think it's nice, but I think all of you will be able to build stuff like this soon enough. I wouldn't get overwhelmed or intimidated. Is there anything else I can answer about this for you?
No, that was just curious. Yeah, it's very open-ended, so I just didn't know, you know, what it were expected to be.
I just expect all of you to be improving from where you're at currently. But yeah, I think this is a reasonable goal. So Kat, can you scroll down a little bit? Just wanted to comment on a few of these sections. Okay, so you showed us a transition in the top one, is that right?
The CSS Transitions, I like had a little section down here.
Didn't you actually have one live on this site?
Yeah, this link.
Yeah, that thing. So I think CSS transitions are really great, really underappreciated. Basically, all it does is specify 2 different styles for an element, kind of like one normally and then one when you hover over the element, and then it just swaps them when the hover state occurs. And you can set like time or duration for it. So instead of it snapping immediately between the 2 states, it takes like a half a second. So that's kind of what you're seeing when she hovers over it there.
Sorry, I just went to the code pen like it so people can see the code too.
Thanks, that helps a lot. So yeah, on the anchor, you see it's got transition, border width, 0.4 seconds. So the border width, when it changes, we're going to say that it takes 0.4 seconds for that to change. We don't just change it instantly. And then below the A hover, that's saying that when we hover over an anchor, we're changing the border width to 20 pixels instead of what it would have been normally. So I really like transitions because if you just want things to animate a little bit, move on your page, transitions are the very simplest way to do that. And they're very often sufficient. It's enough. A lot of people like using CSS animations or God forbid use JavaScript to move things around the page in an animated way. And while you can do that, it's going to be a lot harder. Like you're going to write a lot more code. It's going to be a lot buggier. So you're going to have to spend more time fixing it. I find that transitions are a really reliable and simple way to just make your page look nice, a little bit less dead and dull. So I would definitely recommend you all learn how to use transitions, or at least before you learn animations. Could we look back at your site? Cool, so let's go back up to the top again. Scroll down a little more. Keep going. Oh yeah, so the picture tag. So let me ask you a question. Why do you even want to have so many different source images for this one picture?
To be honest, the reason that I've even found out about it is I've done like a bunch of challenges on Front End Mentor, and it was one of the parameters for one of the challenges where we were supposed to use 2 different images. I don't know in practice if like developers do that frequently or not, but like that's why I learned about it.
Okay. Maybe I can pose this as an open question to the class. Can you think of why you would want to have one image element that has multiple image files inside of it like this?
That way you can, so if you have a website, say if you have like one view, say you have blog posts with a blog post image and you have a list view of all your blogs, might be smaller size. So you might, I know a lot of different frameworks too, they might actually recreate that same image as a different file, and they'll just compress it down into different sizes. So it'll be faster, and also you can adjust it, you can already have it formatted in the right format. That way you get a unique view or format of that image. And then maybe when you click on the link, it'll go and maybe show you like the full bigger image once you're on the post, something like that.
Yeah, so you hit a lot of important points there. So for one thing, some people are going to be using smaller devices. You want to send down a smaller version of the image to match their device size, but you don't want to just be resizing the images to match their device, because then content kind of jumps around a little bit as it's loading. It's better if you can specify upfront exactly how big the image is going to be and send them one that's exactly the right size. But also very importantly, users who are going to be on mobile devices probably are like on a data plan that can't download content very quickly. So if you know that someone is on a small device and they just can't handle the large image, don't send them like a 4K 1 gigabyte image file when you know you're going to have to downsize it to like a postage stamp size. You just send them a smaller image to begin with, to be more respectful of their network so they can download all your content faster. Cool. So yeah, I just wanted to point out that little bit. I just thought it was interesting that you had the picture tag here. Thought it was a good time to mention it. Scroll down a little bit further. Okay, so yeah, the last couple things I just wanted to mention about this is I think that the CSS variables are really cool. That's definitely new. I've been writing CSS for like 8 years now, and people have just been constantly complaining about the lack of variables in CSS. So I'm gonna have to look into that a little bit more, see when that was standardized. Oh yeah, and the multicolor background you had, I think that's really impressive. Just in general, because HTML and CSS is all like boxes inside of boxes. I think it must have been pretty hard to get those like diagonal colored sections. I'm
It's
not
not
sure.
at all.
Okay.
I mean, I can post this article in Slack if anyone's interested, but like it's super simple and it looks really impressive. So it's a very cool thing.
Well, I've written a lot of CSS and I'm impressed by this, so you fooled me. Ivan, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, we started out earlier about the whole image stuff. Would you put that in like the media query, like in order for it to upload or show a certain picture depending on your screen size, or where would you actually apply that? Because that was an issue that I had like a while ago where I just had like a too big of a photo, so like it wouldn't show on my phone properly. It would take like a good couple seconds because it is like a high resolution. So where would you put that to where it only displays the lower resolutions image?
So like you said, media queries are one way you could do that. And we're going to learn about media queries on Wednesday. Yeah, tomorrow we're covering that. But if you look in the picture tag itself, it looks like it actually has a media query built into it, like where you see media equals min width 640 pixels. That's saying like only use that particular, medium.jpg for screens that are that size. Further down, you can see screens that are a minimum of 1024 pixels that uses large.jpg. So media queries, I think, is the answer here, but there's a couple of different ways you can do media query. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But for now, I think it's maybe a good time to get into some new content. I think it was really interesting seeing Kat's favorite HTML elements, CSS properties. But I'm gonna show you the ones that I think are important now. So let me share my screen. All right. Take some notes over here. Okay, so today's lecture, mostly just about CSS. There's going to be a small handful of CSS properties that I'm going to be talking about today. Because like you saw, there's hundreds and hundreds of them. I'm not going to overwhelm you talking about all of them. There's really like 6 CSS properties I want to talk about today. We're going to be talking about display, which is the most basic property in terms determining how much space an element takes up. We're going to talk about position, which lets you put elements anywhere you want them on the page. Going to talk about z-index, controls stacking.
Okay, I don't think I missed anything too like crazy.
Float. And talk about overflow.
Just
When a container has too much content. And lastly, pseudo classes, which are, we can treat them like classes sometimes, but it's really like a dynamic state that an element can be in, like hover. Okay. So first things first, we got to learn how display works. This is the most fundamental CSS property of an HTML element. Every element has the display property set to some value. So by default, most HTML elements have display block. So having display block means that this element takes up the full width of the page, and there will be a line break before and after it. All right, so I'm gonna just make some divs on an HTML page so we can kind of see how these all lay out, so we can see that they are block level elements. Got a basic HTML file. So we got to start with my boilerplate. There's some basic tags that every HTML document needs to have. Does anyone want to just shout out what's the one element that contains all the other HTML elements in my document? Doing a little group review. Yeah, got to have an HTML document, HTML element. This is an opening tag here. And then a closing tag starts with a slash. Together, they make up our HTML element that we can put more content inside of. So what are the two basic HTML elements that we need to have inside of the HTML element?
The head and the body.
Yeah. So every HTML document needs to have a head and a body inside of their HTML element. This is kind of the minimum required markup for any HTML document. A lot of other stuff we can put inside of here, but this structure is pretty rigid. So again, just for review, the body is where we're going to put all of the visible rendered content. Assume that anything in the body of your HTML page is visible to the user. Whereas the head section of our HTML document has kind of meta information about the web page. This isn't actually visible content loaded on the page, but it describes information about it, like style sheets that are linked in, scripts that are linked in, other settings or options that we might set. So inside my body, I'm going to add some divs. All right, so I'm going to add a class to these divs, just so I'll have some way to refer to them later. Just make a few more of them. All right. So let's see what we got. So I've got my HTML file inside of my demos folder here. I'm going to run a web server now really quickly, just to serve this HTML file. There are a few different ways that I could, just view this in my browser. I'm going to use Python to start up a simple little web server. So I'll invoke Python. There's a built-in module that does this for me automatically. So I'll use .m http.server. And I type enter. And so now it tells me that it's serving HTTP on port 8000. So I can go to localhost :8000 in my browser, and I'll see what my website looks like currently. So localhost is the machine I'm connecting to. It's just my current machine that I'm on. And then :8000 is the port number where this application in particular is running. We'll talk more about ports later on, so don't worry about that too much. All right, so this is my website so far. Just 5 divs that all say some content. Doesn't look like much right now, but if we want to understand this a little bit better, we can inspect it. So I'm going to right-click it and then go to inspect. This brings up my developer tools. You're going to need to get really well acquainted with DevTools when you're debugging or just developing front-end code. This is going to tell you, how all your HTML elements are coming together, what's inside of what. Console over here tells you if your JavaScript is working or if it's logging values. The network tab shows you documents that you download. This is going to get more interesting later on this demo. But for right now, we're just looking at the Elements tab. And if I want to inspect any of these divs, there's not really too much to see that's interesting because I haven't styled them yet. But if we go over on the right side here on this Styles tab, we can see div has display block. And then over here, this text tells us where this style is coming from. So user agent style sheet means that this is a default style from the browser. So it wasn't set by the website that you're visiting. It's not in some CSS style sheet that you downloaded from this website. This is just the default way that your browser renders divs. They are display block. So again, if you see user agent style sheet, that means that it's a default style that you did not apply. Now also, if I hover over these divs, you can see this blue box that highlights. That's telling me where the content of this div is. So if I want to know how much space all my HTML elements are taking up, I can just hover over them here. And you'll notice that each blue box is taking up the full width of the page, even though the text inside of it is very small. It's just a couple words. The div, because it's a block level element, it's going to take up the full width of the page regardless. Excuse me. All right, so we're gonna change one of these boxes here a little bit. So this third box, I'm gonna add an ID to it. Can anyone tell me real quick what's the difference between a class and an ID?
The class is going to be for multiple elements, whereas an ID is just for one.
Right. So classes and IDs are both pretty similar, just in the fact that they're both kind of labels that we use for referring to an element later. You know, we can apply, I've applied the same class box to all these divs so that later we'll see in our CSS, I can style them all at once using that class. IDs are similar. We can style things by their ID, but the difference is only one element on the page should have a given ID. If you have two elements on the same page with the same ID, then that is an error and your CSS might not behave the way you expect it to. Then I'm going to add another element over here, a strong. Is anyone familiar with the strong element?
Isn't that bold or something like that?
It is something like that. So I just refreshed the page after putting a strong tag around some content. And like Ivan was saying, we can now see it as bold. I would argue that the effect of this tag is actually slightly different than just making something bold. Rather, strong is a semantic tag. It means that this information is more important. And so commonly, when you just put it on text, that makes it bold. But I think it's different for screen readers. Like if you have a strong tag around text that a screen reader is looking over, it'll just say it more loudly or with emphasis. Whereas if you have a screen reader going over bold text, like with the B tag, that doesn't necessarily say it differently. So the strong tag has some semantic meaning. But the important point that I want to make to you here is that also the strong tag has a different default display type. The strong tag is an inline element. All right, so some elements
have the display type inline. And this means that an inline element doesn't actually have its own dimensions. It just neatly wraps some other element, kind of like shrink wrap. Okay. So for the box here, this is a div. This is a block level element. Because it's a block level element, I can give it height. So if I just want to edit the element right here, I just clicked on element.style, and I'm going to try to edit it right in my browser live and type height colon 50 pixels. So now if I inspect this element, we can see that the blue bar is a lot taller. It's taking up all this extra space because I set a 50 pixel height on this div, because divs are block level elements. They can have defined height and width. And if I want, I can set width, say 400 pixels over there. And so now you can see the blue bar only goes 400 pixels to the right, but still that doesn't let us put any other div on the same line as it. Doesn't let us put any other content on the same line as it, because even when our div only takes up half the screen as a block level element, we still put a line break after it. The strong though, the strong is going to work a little bit differently. As an inline element, the strong tag does not have its own dimensions. So if I try to set height on the strong tag, height is, 500 pixels. This does absolutely nothing, nothing at all. Setting dimensions like height and width on an inline element just has no effect in CSS. Because this strong, it's really just like wrapping this text some content. So it's only going to be exactly as big as the text is. If I made the font size larger, font size 26 pixels. So that makes the strong tag bigger because the thing that's wrapping is now bigger. But setting height on the strong tag itself does nothing. It doesn't have defined dimensions. All right, so does everyone kind of see the distinction here between block level elements and inline elements? One is just very greedy and takes up as much space as it can, block elements. And then the inline elements are much more friendly, I guess, play nicely with others. They take up as little space as possible, just neatly wrapping whatever they're containing. Sound good? All right, so there's a problem here in that neither of these two display types really does everything that we want it to. Because block level elements are nice because we can give them size and shape and everything, but it's hard to put them exactly where we want. Like we can't put two of them on the same row very easily because they're block level. They always have a line break after them. And inline elements, we can put them in a row, but they don't have their own dimensions. So it's hard to size things the way we want them to. So we need another display type that is a combination of inline and block. That is called inline block. All right, so there are I don't think actually any elements are by default inline block. Maybe images, IMG is the only one. For the most part though, to take advantage of the inline block style, you'll have to set it explicitly. So I'm going to add a CSS file to my HTML file so we can write some styles for it. Does anybody remember how to link CSS styles into an HTML file? So quick review from yesterday.
Is it a link with the style sheet in link and rel with the style sheet within quotation marks?
Uh-huh. And then what else?
It's source or hyperreference.
Yep.
With the file name.
And I haven't made this file yet, but I'm going to do that in just a second. So this is the minimum that you need for linking a CSS file into your HTML. You use a link tag, which doesn't actually link one page to another like an anchor tag. I think the name is maybe a little misleading. This is to link other files into this HTML file. Then you have to declare how that other file relates to this HTML file. What's the relation between these two files? In this case, the relation is a style sheet. The file that I want to import is styling the current document. So that's the relation. There are other relations for files that you can potentially link in. The most common one is style sheet though. And then lastly, the hyperlink reference. Where on the internet can we find this other file that is being linked? This is also maybe a little bit confusing because there are other HTML elements that let you pull in remote dependencies from the internet, IMG or script. But on those, they might use src instead of href to do kind of the same thing. So you just have to kind of remember that link tags use the href. Andrew, question?
Yeah, when you put style sheet in there, is that like a word that has to go in there, or can you write whatever you want in there?
You have to write style sheet. I can show you in a second that it just won't work if I write anything else there. So let's write my first style here. So in my index.html, I've got these boxes with the class box. If I want to target them in my CSS, how do I write that selector? Should be some review from the day before.
Is it dot class name?
It is dot class name. I have a class called box. I want to write styles that apply to it. So I write dot to indicate that this is a class name, and then the name of the class is box, some curly braces, and then inside of here, I can write whatever styles I want. So like I was saying, the first thing I want to set is display inline block. And then we're going to go back to the web page. I'm going to refresh in just a second. But what do we expect is going to happen when I refresh the page? What's going to change?
All the content be on the same line.
Yeah. The only thing that was keeping these on separate lines was the fact that divs have a line break after them automatically because they are block level elements. By changing these to inline block, now they'll all be a little bit more friendly. They'll be willing to sit next to each other and share horizontal space. However, because they're inline block and not inline, I can still set dimensions on them. I guess it's not obvious now because there's nothing underneath it. So there's nothing that's getting pushed around. But you can see that this one has a very small blue box that is only as big as it needs to be. This one, I've manually set it to be much bigger than it would be automatically. So now the blue box is much bigger, showing you the content that it's got there. So let's add some more styles actually to my style sheet. Make these boxes a little bit easier to see. Okay, so now these are a little bit prettier. We can actually see our well-defined boxes all lined up in a row. I just want to address Andrew's question real quick. If we change this from a style sheet to a stylish sheet, just want to show people how stylish we are. Now my browser suddenly has no idea what I'm talking about, doesn't know why I'm trying to link in this other file or what it's supposed to do here, and it just does nothing. So that is actually something that needs to be spelled correctly, precisely every time. Rel equals style sheet, or else your browser is going to have no idea what you're doing. I've definitely lost a lot of time debugging CSS because I forgot to do this one thing. So I'm hoping that you all do not encounter this same issue. John, you have a question?
Yeah, so if inline block kind of does the best of both worlds, is there ever a situation where you would want to use inline or block instead of inline block?
I mean, for the elements that are by default inline, I think it makes the most sense for them to stay inline generally, you know, like strong, anchor, emphasis. And there are some times when you want a container to take up as much space as it can. So there are certainly instances where display block is useful. I feel like in general, though, I use display block for pretty much everything when I'm building layouts. Although we'll also get to Flexbox. So there are some newer properties in CSS. Flexbox is one of my favorites. That'll give you some other options for how you build your layout. So you might not have to use inline block for exactly everything. Flexbox is another option. But in general, I do think inline block is the most like basic, the most versatile value of the display property. Okay, so the next part of this demo, I'm going to add a bunch more boxes here. So let's see how that looks. So I've got a whole bunch of boxes now. And my question is, how do I know like how these are going to line up when I have too many boxes for one row? So this is something that's called the document flow. That is, if I'm not doing anything to force elements to be in a specific place, there is a natural way that elements will kind of fall onto the page. So the document flow basically means that all elements will essentially fall into the top left corner of the screen and then fill out the row to the right. So I guess it's kind of like how you would, write English text on a page. But you can see the first div is in the top left corner. As I scroll down, hovering through them, eventually the next one just comes up in the left corner on the second row. And they keep wrapping around like that. That's the default natural order of just putting a whole bunch of inline block elements on a page without specifying more where they should go. Oftentimes, this is where you want them to go. but as we'll learn later on that there are ways you can manipulate this. Okay, so my next question for you all is, how do we know how many divs can fit in one row? So for example, I set each of these divs to be 100 pixels wide. So we see that right over there, 100 pixels. I'm going to adjust my screen here. You can see in the top right, the screen size. Oh, too far. Okay, so now my screen is exactly 1000 pixels wide. And I've set the boxes to be 100 pixels wide. So doing a little math, I would expect to see 10 divs fit in one row, right? That's just, 100 times 10. But that's, or 1000 divided by 10, 100 pixels. But so that's not what I'm seeing. So instead, I've only got 7 divs in a row here. Can anyone tell me, anyone have any hypotheses? Why am I not seeing 10 divs in a row? And what can I do to get these to line up the way I want?
Is it your margin?
Okay, that's definitely part of it.
Margin and padding.
Those are
Padding's
both,
inside, right? Padding goes inside.
And border.
there's a bunch of things going on here.
Is there
Fixed
something with a
position.
gap? Something with gap?
So the first thing I want to point out is that every HTML element is a set of boxes. So HTML itself is just boxes inside of boxes, divs inside of divs, but every individual element itself is also a set of boxes. We call this the box model. So if you hover over this little diagram on the right, it'll show you the box model for any individual element. But basically, the inner box is called the content box. This is, the actual content, the text you put inside of an element and any fixed size you set to it. So here it's 100 by 100 because I've set height and width are 100. But then there's also, let's say first there's border, which it's exactly what it looks like. It's a black border around the outside of your element. Then you've got padding, which creates space between the border and the content, because it looks kind of ugly a lot of time if the content is like right next to your border. So you want to have some padding to give it a little breathing room. And then lastly, the margin is this little orange box we see here. This is the space outside of the border that pushes up against other elements next to it. So it looks like there's a lot of things that are creating space here. I'm going to remove the margin because that's creating space in between our boxes. Okay, so in our CSS file, so I had margin set to 10 pixels. I'm just gonna comment that out. Okay, so now everything is a lot more snug. Looks like everything is, yeah, it's a lot more snug. 1, 2, 3. But we're only getting 8 blocks in a row here instead of the 10 I was hoping for. So before we had 7, now we have 8, getting more of them fit in, but it's not what I was looking for. Does anybody have another idea of why I'm not getting all of these boxes to fit?
It's the padding, right?
Yeah, so padding also adds some extra space. So I've set the width to be 100 pixels. but the padding adds to that. So
Is
that's why.
the, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Is the padding the extra space after the word content inside the box?
Yes. Well, that's part of it at least. So can you see in the box where there's the green box that comes up here? I'll just make it bigger. Excuse me. I'll just make this bigger so you can see it more easily. So I'm just scrolling on this, and you can adjust values up and down by scrolling, which is pretty convenient if you have to move them a lot. But now you can see the padding is much bigger. It's this green box that's inside of the border and outside of the content. It's definitely important to have padding and make things look professional. Let me just refresh that real quick. So yeah, the padding adds some space. Even though I set these elements to be 100 pixels wide, the width is 100 pixels. When I hover over them here, it's telling me, div.box is 108 by 108. So the reason for that is because the content is 100 pixels, but then the padding adds 4 pixels, 2 on each side. And then the border adds another 2 pixels on each side for a total of 108 pixels of width. Does everybody see what's going on here? How I set it to be 100 pixels, but we're actually getting that it's 108 pixels wide. I'm going to trust everyone's nodding their heads. So what this is about is a CSS property called box sizing. The question is, what actually counts as width? So by default, the value of box sizing, I believe, is called content box. Actually, let's just see if I can see it here. Maybe not. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make here is by default, the padding and border are both counted as part of the width of the HTML element. Or let's phrase this differently. We're both added onto the width of the element. But oftentimes we don't want HTML to work this way. It would be nice if we could set the width of the element for like mathematical purposes, like, okay, I want to fit 10 of these divs into 1,000 pixel screen, so they should be 100 pixels wide. It would be nice if we could set the width simply to do math, but then also set the border and padding to be whatever we want for artistic purposes without having to update the width. So we can do that by changing the box sizing property to border box. So what this means is that if we set the width of an element to be 100 pixels wide, but there's 2 pixels of border, 2 pixels of padding, then the content has to shrink down to make space for the padding and border so that the total width is still 100 pixels. So I'm gonna set that property In this case, I don't want to set this on just one element. I want every element in my page to behave the same way. I want to, do my math in a consistent manner. So I'm going to just use star, set this CSS property on literally every element. Say box sizing, border box. Go back to my page. Then when we refresh, we can see that it's a little bit narrower now. We've squeezed in a couple more boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7. So we got 9 boxes now instead of 8. But there's still some problems with our layout. So let's see here. If I inspect it. So now this is showing me a little bit more what I expect. Each of these divs are 100 pixels by 100 pixels wide, which is what I expect based on the settings in my CSS. Now note, they also have margin and padding. Padding and border, but CSS is automatically subtracting these numbers from the content so that the overall width is the same. So I can show you that here. If I make the border bigger, it's just going to squeeze the content in, but it's not going to actually make the box itself larger. So you'll see that the content just squeezed in, so I can adjust the border without actually changing my layout itself. Whereas the other way, if we take off box sizing border box here, now when I change the border, just everything gets bigger because that border is added onto the 100 pixel width. So this is much less useful, very hard to properly size a website like that. So we're going to use box sizing border box so that the padding and border are automatically used to calculate the proper width. Okay, so we fixed that up, but there is still something wrong in our markup here. Why are we not getting 10 of our divs in a row? Does anybody have any ideas?
It looks like that the columns are separated.
Yeah, so there's some separation in between these individual divs. It's really weird because if I'm looking at the box model, it's not the margin. These divs don't have any margin that's pushing against each other, and there's nothing else outside the border. So this is going to bring us to one of the stranger parts of HTML, but white space matters. So the spaces that I'm seeing in between my boxes are actually the new lines here. Because of the way I wrote my HTML markup, I've added, the new line instead of just putting these all on one line. But that actually renders in the HTML, puts spaces between these guys. So there's a couple of different ways we can solve this problem. All of them are kind of ugly. Just show you real quick what I'm talking about. I'm just going to put all of these on one line really quickly. Just pardon me while I'm editing this here. Okay, so now all of my boxes are in this one line, and I've taken out the white spaces in between, which is a terrible way to write your code. This is like super hard to read. I just want to illustrate really quickly that the white space is actually the problem. So there, I refresh the screen. I refresh the page after removing all the white space. And so now they're actually sitting more snugly. I really don't like this solution though, so I'm going to show you a slightly preferable way to handle this situation. Okay, so the problem is that the new lines, this white space character, is causing actual space in between our divs. So I can just set the font size to 0, And so then it won't render. So all of my boxes are contained inside of the one div, the box. And then just to review, when we select an element by its ID, we use the hash sign. So this is the big difference between styling elements by class and ID. The dot refers to classes, the hash refers to IDs. So now to style the box, to get rid of those spaces, I'm going to set font size 0 pixels, or just say 0. Units don't matter when it's 0, because 0 pixels is the same as 0 inches. Wait, I'm sorry, that was definitely not what I was intending to do. Let me try this again. I did not want to set the style on the one box. I wanted to set it on the div containing all my boxes. So I'm going to set an ID over here. It's called boxes. I'm going to change this. Boxes. Okay, so now we can see again that all of my divs are snug next to each other. I'm able to write my code the way I want to. It's easy to read on multiple lines, but I've also removed the spaces in between them from those new line characters. But now I have created yet another problem. Can anyone tell me real quick what went wrong?
What if you want to write something?
Yeah. So I also set font size to 0 for all of the text inside of these boxes. So that is very clearly not what I wanted to happen here. That's one of the quirks of font related properties in CSS is that they get inherited from parent to child. So for the most part, this makes sense. If you set a font size on a paragraph, and then you have a strong tag inside of that paragraph, you shouldn't have to manually set the font size for the strong tag also. You'd like to assume that it inherits the font size from its parent. Same thing for font colors, line height, just for all of the typographic properties, it makes a lot of sense to inherit from their parent. Whereas you wouldn't do that for other CSS properties. If a parent div has height and width and color, you wouldn't want the child to automatically inherit the height and width and color. You're probably going to want to set it to be a different size, color, shape, whatever, because it's a different div. It doesn't exactly make sense for height and width to be inherited. So that's a little tricky thing that you have to remember. Font related properties are inherited. Most CSS properties are not inherited. So in this case, because we set font size on this div, the boxes, it is also applied to these divs and to this strong. So in order to override that, I'm just going to add another CSS selector. So how do I target elements that are inside of this div? What's the syntax for that?
Star.
Yeah, well, what else? Do I just boxes star or?
Well, a space star, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. So CSS syntax is pretty minimal. If I want to style something inside of another thing, you use the space for that. So this hash boxes space star means inside of an element with the ID of boxes, apply these styles to all other elements. So we're going to set font size, not actually a specific number. I'm going to set this to initial. Just go back to whatever the default size was before something else set its font size. So this prevents me from having to think too hard about it. This is just kind of a concise workaround for that white space issue. So now I've got the text here, and I've gotten rid of my white space in between the borders. But there's still some problem. Still only getting 9 divs here. Where is this extra space coming from?
Doesn't the body tag have a default margin of 8 pixels or something?
Yes, yes, it does. So as I'm scrolling through, I noticed there's this extra space on the side. I'm trying to figure out where that comes from. If you scroll on the body, it has default styling applied to it. Margin 8 pixels from the user agent style sheet. So I didn't write this, it just comes default in the browser, but I don't want it. So I'm going to write my own style to override it. Margin is 0. And now we finally get 10 divs lined up in our window. It is exactly 1,000 pixels wide. I've set the divs to be exactly 100 pixels, and we have exactly 10 of them with no gaps. So I'm sure that was a lot harder than you were all expecting it to be, because this is CSS and simple things are not simple, but that's how it works. And I hope this was informative to you and also a decent brief review of HTML. I think we are long overdue for a break, but would anyone like to ask some questions before we go? Jen?
Could you repeat what the star does again in the CSS
Yeah,
there?
star just means everything or anything. So this style does not apply to boxes, does not apply to this actual div itself, hash boxes, but it will apply to any single element that is inside of that div. So star is just whatever. And like we used it over here also for box sizing. I want every single element on this page to have box sizing border box. So I just put that in the star selector. Sound good?
Yep, thank you.
Cool. Saw a few other hands up. Someone just shout out. There's a bunch
I've
of
got a
people.
question.
Yep.
How did you get your example environment again? The
I'm
local
sorry,
page?
your audio just cut out for a second. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. How did you get the example environment again?
Like how am I running
The local
server?
page?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways you can do this. Let me just crash out of this here. So, I mean, for one thing, you can just double click an HTML file and it opens in your browser. That's certainly one option. I am preferring to run an HTTP server on my local machine, because that means that as I'm testing and developing like this, it's going to be a little bit closer to how the actual web application is going to run in production. I guess one important difference I want to point out here is when I just do open dot, double click the HTML file, you see in the top left here, it says file and then the file path. So that's using the file protocol. My browser knows that it's running a document off my local machine. Whereas what I was doing before, Python -m, I'm using a Python module. I'm using the HTTP module built into Python, and then has a function called server, which I'm going to use at the command line. I just hit enter, using all the other default settings, and then it runs a server on port 8000. So on my local machine, so that's localhost 8000. This also occupies my tab, so I can't do anything here. It's frozen, so I would have to just make a new terminal tab, which is fine. So now, when I load up the page, it says localhost here. And if I could actually see the full URL, it should show http://localhost. So when you run your app like this with a server, you're actually running it over the HTTP protocol instead of the file protocol. So it behaves a little bit more closely to how your actual application will work when it's live in production. So this is how I prefer to run my app, but it doesn't make a huge difference at this point. Does that help?
Are you just typing localhost :8000 into your URL?
Yeah. That's all it is. I mean, provided that my web server is running. So I double check in my terminal, I see, yeah, serving on port 8000. It hasn't crashed. It's still occupied here. So it looks like the server is running. So I just type in localhost 8000 and this is where I am. Other questions?
I'll go. Could you go back to your style sheet real quick? I think I got a little confused during the lecture. So your ID selector with boxes with font size 0,
Mhm.
it makes it so that the font size for the spaces, like the spaces that we can't see is 0, right? Between the boxes.
Right. Let's
And
see.
then
So yeah, these new lines in between the boxes, I
And
want
then-
those to be font 0.
and then right afterward, the star selector doesn't select that space. It just selects the font within like all the child classes, right?
Right. So this first one is setting font size on this div itself.
Mhm.
And then this selector here is setting the font size on each individual div inside of it. Because
Okay.
otherwise they would just use the value they inherited.
All right. That makes sense to me.
Do we have one other question?
My question was answered from that one.
Okay, cool. All right, so if we have no more questions, I think we are long overdue for a break now. It is 10:23. Let's come back at 10:40. And we'll talk about a few more CSS properties. Thank you for the reminder there. Break was just so long, forgot about it. So yeah, now that this box is position relative, we can use these 4 other CSS properties on it, top, bottom, left, and right. I'm just going to use 2 of them. So we'll set top 30 pixels, left 50 pixels. Okay, so now I've actually moved where my box is sitting at. Because it has relative position, I'm able to use these properties top and left. So it's a little bit weird reading these and understanding what they do. The way I understand this is top pushes the item 30 pixels from the top. So it's a little bit weird that as I make top a larger number, the element actually goes down. And similarly for this left property, I think of this as pushing the element from the left. So when I make this a larger number, it actually moves the item to the right because this is how many pixels it's being pushed from the left. And again, the only reason why these styles do anything is because it is position relative and not position static. If I take off position relative, then all of a sudden these properties don't do anything anymore. I can try to make this as big as I want, small as I want. It's not going to do anything. These properties, top, left, bottom, right, only affect positioned elements. Another thing that I want to point out about position relative is that this only changes where this one box displays visually, but it doesn't actually change how it takes up space. Because you can see that all the other boxes in my layout are exactly in the same place. I still have 10 boxes lined up in my 1000 pixel wide window. So nudging the box around like this with position relative doesn't actually change how my layout takes up space. So you can use position relative for kind of like some artistic pizzazz, make one item in the grid slightly off place, but it doesn't actually mess up your layout. So that's something. All right. So for the next value of position that I want to show off, we're going to have to get some more boxes in here. So I'm just going to do a little copy pasting. Okay, so now I've got a lot more boxes. We can do some scrolling. That's all I wanted to do. So another value for position is fixed. So this one is pretty simple to understand. An element with position fixed is removed completely from the document flow, no longer takes up space where it would have been naturally, and you position it relative to the screen using top, left, bottom, and right. So let's just see that real quick. I'm going to change the box from being position relative to position fixed. And so now we can see that it is 30 pixels down from the top of the window and 50 pixels to the right from the left side of the window. And as I scroll down, it maintains that position relative to the window. So it is no longer in the document flow at all. The space that it would have taken up over here is now filled in by some other div because they're in the document flow, so they just fall into the top left corner since this guy is no longer taking up space there. And yeah, and it just stays on the screen as I scroll, regardless of any other content on the page. So I'm sure you've seen things like this before. It's used for, pop-up ads and login modals. I don't know. Oh yeah, paywalls, nav bars sometimes. Nav bar is probably the only good example of using position fixed. If you want to make sure the navigation is always available at the top of the screen, that's probably a good use case for position fixed. Anything else is very likely to make your users hate you. So just be careful with using this one. All right, now there's one last value of position I want to talk about. This is going to be the most complicated one. So let's take a moment to ask questions before we talk about position absolute. Any questions about relative, fixed, static, position property in general?
I have a question.
Yep.
So when you said position fixed is used for ads and paywalls and stuff, could you go into the properties and change the position to like temporarily remove that paywall?
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
So different paywalls are implemented with different technologies, but I've definitely found a bunch of them where I can just open up the inspector and turn off display none, turn things back to display block, take position fixed off of whatever they're trying to put on top of the whole screen. You can definitely fiddle with their CSS to reveal the article that they're trying to hide from you or whatever. So it's an interesting question. Okay, so an element with position absolute like fixed is removed from the document flow entirely. and it is positioned using top, left, bottom, and right relative to its closest positioned parent. So this is where things are getting a little bit more complicated. For positioning these other elements, we really were just looking at them by themselves. But in order to position an absolute element, we have to look at it in comparison to another element, its closest positioned parent. So I think that these names are a little bit strange because position absolute doesn't really absolutely position something, but it's very relative. It's relative to one other specific element on the page. So if I was choosing the names for things in CSS, I would call this one position relative, and I would call this one position absolute. But I didn't name CSS, and this is what we've got to work with. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to create some new HTML real quick. All right, we're just going to have 3 divs, one side of another. All right, try to give the classes descriptive names just to help you keep track of the relationship, what's on the inside, what's on the outside here. Because we're going to be thinking about the parent-child relationships for these elements in just a second. We're getting rid of main CSS. All right, let me just run this in my web server real quick. Make sure I can actually get the page up, then I'll write some CSS. You can see some boxes and boxes. Okay, yeah, so I'm still running my server from the same place. But now I have to change the URL. Before I was looking at my index.html, and that's the default name. If you don't specify a file name, your web server is going to assume you're looking for index.html. Okay, but now since I'm looking for a different file that's not index.html, it's position.html, I have to actually put in the file name. But now it's found it, it looks like. Got my 3 divs, outer, middle, inner. Okay, so that's great. Looks like my HTML file is loading here, so I'm going to add some CSS to make this a little more interesting. Okay. So remember in my HTML, just got a really simple structure, a div inside of a div, inside of a div. For the CSS, we're mostly just making them colored boxes. So this is what that looks like. Just want to make sure that you can see them clearly. So they're different colors, they're different sizes. But notably, the outer div is position relative. The inner div is position absolute. And then there's nothing set on the middle div. No position property set on the middle div. So let's look at our rendered HTML here and try to understand why the red box is where it is. So if I want to inspect a particular element on the page, another way I can do that is I'm going to click this little arrow icon over here. Y'all can see this little box with a little arrow inside of it. Click that, and now it turns blue. And hover over things on the page. I'm going to click this little red box. Click the red box, and it takes me right in the Elements tab to the item that I just clicked on. So that's a handy little CSS debugging tip. So I'm trying to understand why this box is where it is. So it says right 5 pixels, bottom 10 pixels. But I'm trying to figure out, like, what is that relative to? What is it 5 pixels away from the right side of? What is it 10 pixels away from the bottom side of? If I look at the middle div, that doesn't seem correct. This is like pretty far away from the inner div. It doesn't look like this inner guy is spaced like 5 or 10 pixels away from it. And that's because the middle div is not positioned at all, because it has the position static. We say that this middle div is not positioned, and therefore something with position absolute cannot be positioned relative to something that's position static. So we need a parent element that is not position static, that has any position property. So if we go to the parent of the middle div, we get the outer div. And now this guy is positioned, it has position relative. And now position relative on its own doesn't make it appear in a different location. This is the outer div is still rendered in the same location it would appear in if it was a statically positioned element. But because it is relative position, it is technically speaking a positioned element. That means other elements can be positioned relative to this outer div. So it's the fact that we have position relative on this outer div that means this right and this bottom are relative to the edge of the outer div. So even though it's 2 parents up, it's the closest positioned parent. So for this inner div, I'm positioning it 5 pixels from the right side of the black outer div, and then 10 pixels from the bottom of the black outer div. Now, if we change things up a little bit, if I remove position relative from the outer div, then it no longer has any positioned parent, and it'll instead be just positioned relative to the window. So if I just take off position relative, now my inner div has no idea what it's supposed to be relative to, because as a position absolute element, it should look for a positioned parent. But the middle div does not have position set, outer div does not have position set, body doesn't have position set, so it's going to be relative to the whole window. 5 pixels from the right, 10 pixels from the bottom, which again is not typically what we want. Generally, you want to decide what this absolute item should be relative to, and then you put relative position on that parent element. So here, I didn't want the inner div to be relative to the middle, want it to be relative to the outer. So I put position relative on the outer. I could change that by putting position relative on the middle. And so now the middle div is the inner red div's closest positioned parent. Used to be that it wasn't, we had to skip over the middle and find it on the outer. But now we just go up 1 parent level and find that the middle div is a positioned parent of the inner div because it's position relative. So now the red div is positioned 5 pixels from the right side of the inner green div and 10 pixels from the bottom of the inner green div. So a few moving pieces that have to come together to make this work. But the important thing is that I'm using an element with position relative as the parent, and then some other child element with position absolute can be positioned relative to the parent with position relative. I know this is
So
kind of
sorry, is it safe to say that if you move the parent, then the children go along with the parent no matter where? Like say you wanted to move the parent box over to the right side of the screen, everything else would go with it?
Mm-hmm. So let's see. So now I've got this inner div is relevant relative to the outer, which has position relative. So if on this guy, I add, say, left 200 pixels, moves the outer div all the way over to the right. And then this inner div is positioned relative to outer div, so it moves to the right as well. Make sense? Maybe kind of. It's okay if y'all are having a hard time like grokking this just the first time you see it. Position is probably the hardest concept in CSS. This is probably the single most difficult property to like figure out how to use reliably. But I really feel like once you get a solid grasp on position, and especially using position absolute with position relative, it's like a superpower in CSS. You can just do anything pretty much. It's like a little bit more code and it's a little bit uglier than some other techniques, but like this will basically always work. There's no problem, no positioning problem you can't solve with absolute and relative and being smart about margins and padding and other stuff. All right, I know it's a lot, but do we have any questions? If not, I'll move on to talk about Z-index. No questions, okay.
Sorry, I just got one more question about the absolute. Would you mind like give a real life example saying why would you want to use absolute and relative? Like in what kind of website, web page you would want to use like an actual example?
I mean, probably something that's a little bit more like creatively oriented with some like artistic kind of, yeah, something that like a designer asked you to build. Probably this wouldn't be just like a really utilitarian like dashboards with tables or something. But if you're like, I don't know, building an event web page for a band or something, you want it to look cool and funky, maybe a designer would say like, hey, as we're building this layout, this one element should be kind of floating off over here a little bit. Just if you want to precisely control exactly where on the page things go. Because normally, you're subject to the document flow. Elements will kind of fall into the page in a very specific order. So if you want them to go anywhere else, position absolute is definitely one option that'll always work. You can always put things anywhere you want to.
Okay, thank you.
Is this kind of what you would use if you wanted, like, say you wanted a menu bar to stay at the top of the screen while you scroll through like a splash page or something like that? Is this kind of the concept that would keep that menu bar up top?
For a menu bar that you just want to stay at the top of the screen, position fixed is probably more appropriate for that.
Okay.
I think if I had an item that I wanted floating inside of a div, like this red box, maybe I just want to keep this floating at the bottom here. It's not relative to the screen itself, but I think how to put this. So yeah, it's not relative to the screen itself, but just relative to this one box. So I might like scroll through this box if it had more content inside of it, and I would want this red box to stay in the lower corner. I feel like the Spotify design does things like this. Like they have all kinds of floating elements inside of scrollable sections. So there's some floating item that's not just like on your screen in one specific spot, but it's like inside of some scrolling container. I don't know, it's hard for me to think of a really simple example off the top of my head because this is generally used for non-simple use cases. For a simple problem, there's probably a simpler way to solve it that doesn't require you setting position on multiple elements. But it's definitely like if the designer walks in and has some really wacky requirements and you're like, this is not at all how HTML works normally. Maybe you'll be able to get it working, get it looking like it does in the picture by using position absolute. So it's definitely an important tool to keep in your toolbox. I've definitely used this a lot for like creating layouts in CSS. All right, any other questions about position before we move on to Z-index? All right, so I've made a couple of other HTML and CSS files we're going to use to talk about Z-index a little bit. So I'm actually going to move this inner div a little bit off to the side a little bit so you can see it a little more easily, setting it right to -15 pixels. All right, got to update the CSS file we're including. Okay, there we go. So right now we've got a few elements stacked up on top of other elements. You can see that this red square is like partially covering up the black here. Now, normally that's not how HTML works. Normally you don't ever have elements stacking literally on top of each other elements like this. They'll just be next to each other. But because we're using positioning, this becomes possible. So by default, the order of what appears on top of what, I think is just based on the order it appears in the HTML. This is the innermost item, and so it's going to appear on top. But there are ways that we can control this with Z-index. So Z-index is just a ranking of like the vertical placement of items, like how close it is to the user, like popping out of your screen, kind of. So on the inner one, right now, this guy looks like it's on top of everything. I'm going to set a Z-index for this middle div. Set that to 10. When we refresh the page, excuse me. Oh, because the middle is not actually positioned. Okay, we're gonna have to position this guy then. It's not working exactly how I was expecting. What's going on here?
Do you have to indicate pixels after 10? Or is that a?
So that's a good question. You actually don't. Z-index does not have units because you can't say like how far close to you the item is. It's just a ranking of what's on top of what, the order that it should be rendered in.
Is this for some reason position being called after z-index? Is there like any hierarchy in terms of that? Or if you put z-index underneath position, would that work?
There definitely are complications to this. I'm going to get to this in a second. Maybe I'll just try a slightly simpler example. So all of our boxes are going to be 400 pixels wide. They're going to be position relative. Got different colors on these guys. And then we need to make them overlap. So I'm going to set left 30 pixels. So that's going to get left 60 pixels. Need to save my file after making changes. We'll make these a little smaller. Okay, so now we can kind of see the stacking behavior of these three divs. So the second one, where is it? Has a z-index of 20. Third one has a z-index of 10. So 20 is a higher number than 10, so it stacks on top of it. If we instead change the z-index of this third one to be a larger number, like 30, now we can see that the red div stacks on top of the green one. So this is how z-index is supposed to work in a simple case. But you'll see there are some situations where z-index is not so simple.
Can z-index be a range?
I don't think so, no. I'm not sure how that would work. So a problem that happens commonly when you're working on web applications with like a lot of different developers is one person is working on it. They have to build something that's supposed to go on the top of the page. And they're like, okay, it's got to go on the top of the page. We'll just say z-index 99. And then someone else is working on the same application later. They say, no, I'm building this other element. This one actually has to go on top of the page. So this one should be z-index 999, make sure my thing goes on top. Some other developers working on it months later, they're like, no, okay, this new modal that we're adding, this like really has to be on the top. So it's gonna be 99999 and so on and so forth. I've seen a lot of just like really ugly projects that I had to work on where they had like 6-digit Z indexes. And this is how you know that like something has already gone wrong in this project. So I'm gonna give you kind of my recommendation of how you should pick numbers for Z index. So use multiples of 10. So if something is, near the bottom of the stack, use 10. If something you want to put on top of that, use 20. But that guarantees then that if someone is going to be working on the project after you, and they think like, actually, there's a whole layer of things that needs to go in between these two items. Well, they've got 10 layers of Z-index, 11 through 19 to work with, to put other items in between your two layers. So it kind of like future proofs it a little bit more. Makes it easier for other people to work with your code without modifying your code. So generally, we try to find a style for writing code that makes it less likely that it'll need to change in the future. So this is one way you can do that. Make sure people aren't constantly overwriting your Z index. So I also want to note here that I'm just stacking these divs against each other, first, second, third. If we put other items inside of these, so I can put other divs inside of my second div, and these can have their own Z index as well to stack them relative to each other. But it's really important to note that, like looking at this example here, if third is stacked on top of second, there's nothing I can set the Z index to for these inner divs to put them on top of third. The reason for this is that Z index is not global, but it's relative to your parent. They say that a parent that is like position relative or absolute that has elements inside of it, it creates a stacking context. That is, it can have elements inside of it that are stacked relative to each other with a Z index, but it's not relative to other elements on the page. So kind of the way I think about this, if you want like a physical metaphor, is imagine you have two clear plastic binders, and each of the binders has documents inside of them, but you also put one of the binders entirely on top of the other binder. There's no way that any document in the bottom binder can be on top of any document in the top binder, because that entire bottom binder is beneath the one on top. So everything inside of it is also going to be stacked below everything inside of the binder on top. So like in our HTML example here, let's go back, say here, Z index is 10 for the second, and it's 20 for the third. There is nothing that I could possibly set Z index to for these inner divs to put them on top of this third div, even if I set them to like 999, 10,000 or whatever, it doesn't matter, because this entire third div is on top of this entire second div. Any questions about that? I don't need to talk about z-index for too long. Ideally, you avoid situations where it's necessary, because that gets a little weird when you're stacking things vertically. And also runs the risk that your site becomes inaccessible if something the user needs to click on is under something else, or if it's off the screen. Jake?
Yeah, I was hoping you could go back to the page and explain. I get the z-index part, but the positioning. I know it seems so simple, but I'm having a hard time understanding why those red, green, and black are positioned the way they are on the page.
Yep. So first of all, I would definitely say that this is not simple. This is probably the most complex aspect of CSS, and certainly the trickiest thing that I'm going to mention in this demo today, or even this week, probably.
I don't mean this one here. I meant like the latest stuff you showed us where it was inline. And it's like you've got the first is, it said 60 pixels, or was it from the left?
Yeah, normally it would be right there, up in the top left corner.
Okay.
But because it has position relative, I am allowed to use top left, bottom right. And then I use left over here to move it left 60 pixels.
So then the green is positioned off of that, the 80 pixels. Is that off of the black, the right side of the black one?
So it's not actually relative to where the black one visually appears. It's relative to where it would be normally in the document flow. So here, let's see. Okay, so if I don't position the second one or the third one, but I only position the first one, you can see it moves a little bit over to the right, but it doesn't move the other ones out of the way. When I'm using left like this with a position relative element, it changes where it visibly appears, but it doesn't actually change how it takes up space. It doesn't push the other elements around.
Okay, I see it now. I was having a hard time understanding. It's the green one's moving from where it would have otherwise been, not relative to the black one.
Right.
Okay.
But I mean, given that the black one is taking up space here, this is where it would normally be. So I can position it relative to that space.
Okay, thank you so much.
That helps. Good. I'm glad. Any other questions real quick? We're going to talk about floats.
Sorry, Raphael, I just got one more question.
Yep.
Something I want to make sure. So the size of the Z index, it won't affect like how much of a portion will be covered by the other element. Is that correct? Say
Correct.
it's like 10 compared to 100. Okay.
Yeah, it just matters what's on top of what. So like here, the red one is on top because it's got the biggest Z index. I can make this much larger, and it doesn't matter because it was on top before, it's still on top now. It doesn't visually change anything. It's just the relative order of everything. That's why there's no units for the Z index.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I want to do a very quick demo on floats. Has anyone worked with floats before? Have you heard of these? You kind of know what they do? Anybody? Nobody?
I've used them before.
Okay. Can you tell me generally what they're for, in your opinion, in your experience? Kat?
Kat, you're muted.
Sorry. I mean, they're a way to like make elements kind of get out of the flow of the page without using like flex specs or grid.
So that's true. Using float does remove an element from the regular document flow, but it doesn't remove it entirely. It actually kind of changes the rules about how neighboring elements react to it. So in my opinion, the reason why a lot of websites are terrible is because people use floats when maybe they shouldn't be. And a lot of reasons why some junior developers think CSS is hard and have a hard time, building pixel perfect designs is because they use floats when maybe they shouldn't be. It's because it doesn't entirely remove an element from the document flow. It just changes how things interact with it. It means that suddenly you have to kind of relearn how a lot of different CSS properties will interact with floats. And I find it's just generally kind of hard to reason about, hard to work with, and then hard to build off of because everything around it does kind of wacky things. So let me tell you what I actually think floats are for. So floats are actually for wrapping text around images. So I'm sure you've ever seen like in a magazine or whatever, there's, full page of text, but they have an image in the top right corner or something. And so they don't just start all the text below the image, but they kind of wrap it around the image. So that isn't something that HTML does naturally because everything wants to just be a block, a square or a rectangle or something. But floats let us achieve that effect. So I'm going to show you literally the only thing I will ever use floats for, because anything else is just frustrating and madness. So I'm going to add 2 classes to this div here. So I said before that this is primarily for wrapping text around images. Instead of grabbing an image real quick, I'm just going to use a div that's a square. It's the same concept. You can wrap text around any square HTML element, but most commonly images. So that's going to be our image. And we're going to have some text. Okay. Now we're going to write some CSS. Text block, keep it simple. Just 24 pixel font so we can read it. Our pretend image is just going to be a square. And then here's all the magic. Float right. There are only two values for float. You can float left or you can float right. See what this does. Didn't link my CSS in properly, so let's do that. Okay. Maybe we'll make this a little bigger. Okay, so this is the only way that I would ever use floats for wrapping text around an image. So you can see, first of all, that the HTML is kind of behaving in a different way than how it normally would. You know, just looking at the page, we see the text is first, and then we see the image on the right. Normally, the way the document flow goes, I would think that the text was first in the HTML and that the image was afterwards. But the way you float an image is you have the image first, and then the text that you want to wrap around it comes afterwards. But because this image is floated, it's going to share horizontal space with other block level elements. So, you know, normally this paragraph, it would be a box. It wouldn't let other elements inside of it, like you see the red box in the top right. Because the red box is floating, this paragraph is willing to share horizontal space with it. So we can get the text wrapping around the image as if this was like some kind of magazine layout. You know, naturally, if we did not have float, it would look like this. We just have our div up on the top because it's a block level element, takes up the full width, and then our paragraph is below it. So to achieve this effect, we use float right. Could have just as easily done float left, and it wraps around on the other side. If we want to control the float property in another element, there's a clear property, which basically means don't share space with floated elements on this side. So on the paragraph, I can add clear left, and this does nothing because there are no elements floated on the left side of the paragraph. I change it to clear right. And so now we change how this actually behaves. The pretend image is still floated to the right side of the screen, but this paragraph is no longer sharing horizontal space with it. So if you have to deal with floats for some reason, and you notice that they're like clipping inside of some other div and they're not supposed to do that, you don't want them to be sharing horizontal space with a floated item, the way you control that is with the clear property. So yeah, there's not too much else to floats and clears. I mostly recommend that you just don't use them, to be honest. But I do think it is kind of a fundamental CSS property. So I'd recommend you be familiar with that. Let's see, then there is one last thing that I want to cover today, one last CSS property. We're going to talk about overflow. So simple enough, overflow is the CSS property that controls what happens when there's too much content to fit inside of a container. So why don't we just make a quick demo for that. All right, so let's get rid of this pretend item, but we've still got our text block here with way too much text in it. Can make this bigger. I want to scroll. I want to have too much text. Make this 36 pixels. Not quite enough. Okay, now we've got some text. We can scroll through here a little bit. So first thing I want to point out here is that this paragraph, scrolling through in the inspector, it tells me that it's 1215 pixels wide by 1452 pixels tall. I didn't set the width or the height. The width is just the full width of my browser, and the height is just as much height as it needs to contain its contents. By default, most HTML elements will expand vertically so that they can include all of their contents. But what if we set a specific height for the container that is too large to contain its contents? So we've got our text block here. I'm going to set a height, 500 pixels. Um, What is the default value for overflow? Yeah, okay. So it looks like setting the height didn't actually do anything. Just by setting the height by itself doesn't do anything. I have way too much text, and we still see way too much text here. It's all on the screen. If we don't want that to happen, we can set overflow. So overflow hidden is probably the most common thing you would set this to. The default value would be overflow show or overflow visible, I believe. Overflow hidden means anything that doesn't fit in the element's height just gets cut off. So here, yeah, my screen is about 500 pixels high, 433 pixels high, actually. And so when I scroll down just a little bit, that's where the text gets cut off. Like, I know that there's way more text here. If I look in my inspector, there's way more than just what's on my screen. But because I have overflow hidden and I set this to 500 pixels high, it's going to cut off the text at that point. So another option here, instead of overflow hidden, overflow scroll, kind of does what it sounds like. If there is too much content, then it just adds a scroll bar. Which I don't know if it's easy to see here, but it's actually a separate scroll bar from like the regular page scroll bar. So you can have divs inside of divs that like each scroll independently. And it definitely gets really hard to work with your website if you do that. So I would caution you against having nested scrollable sections. But if you need to do that, this is how you can do it. So if we put some padding here. Okay, yeah, put some more padding in here. All right, so I added some padding onto this div here, and you can now see that there's two different scroll bars. Like there's one for the page itself, which is only 500 pixels because this element has a max height of 500 pixels. But then inside of this text block, I can still continue scrolling all the way to the bottom of all the text because I've set overflow scroll. One downside to overflow scroll is that it'll always make the scroll bars appear, even if there isn't enough content to scroll through. So you might get inconsistent, or no, what am I saying? So it'll just like look kind of weird, I guess, if there isn't actually any content to scroll through and you display the scroll bar anyway. So overflow scroll is like maybe not the prettiest setting. What's I think a little bit more useful is overflow auto, which will use overflow scroll if there's enough content to scroll, but if there's not enough content to scroll, then it hides the scroll bar. So actually, that's kind of what Mac OS does anyway, just automatically. You know, I can't see the scroll bar here until I'm scrolling. So like on Mac OS, overflow scroll and overflow auto are pretty similar, but I believe on like Chrome for Windows, you actually get different behaviors using overflow scroll versus overflow auto. So that's definitely important. You need to make sure that users can scroll your app properly, especially on a mobile application. It can be very hard. If you have scrolling sections inside of other scrolling sections, it can be very hard to navigate the web page. So you got to be careful with that. This isn't too complicated, I'm hoping, but do we have any questions about overflow, what this might be used for? No questions. All right, well, we got like 10 minutes left here, so I'm going to give you a little bit of bonus content here. These are all the CSS styles that I really want you to know about, but I'm also going to talk about some CSS pseudo classes for 5-10 minutes. Just want to introduce this concept to you. Going to delete some of this text here. Don't need all of this. So for the most part, when we want to apply styles to an item, we use classes to do so because it's easy to apply a class to a lot of elements. Then you can, refer to them all with one selector. But there are also, excuse me, some predefined pseudo classes in CSS. These are things that we can style that are like classes, but they're dynamic. They change from time to time. So probably the simplest example is hover. So we use the period to refer to regular classes. The colon, it's kind of like two periods, refers to a pseudo class. So this is going to target anchors, but only while I'm hovering over them. So there's some additional context to it. So let's say this word lot here, I'm going to make this an anchor. It's going to go to Google. So at first it has the default link coloring. Why are you? Okay, links are kind of temperamental. We're going to make this a strong instead. Okay, So by default, the strong is black because I haven't set its colors or anything. But because it has the pseudo class strong : hover, when I hover over any strong elements, they're going to get these styles applied to them. So here I hover over it and it changes colors. I'm not using any JavaScript to make this happen, just pure CSS. Generally speaking, there will be a lot of problems you'll encounter where you could solve them either with CSS or with JavaScript, or maybe with just a little bit of HTML. And in general, I want to encourage you to use the simplest tools, use the simplest solution that's available for a given problem. So if you can solve some styling layout problem using just CSS without any JavaScript, that is probably preferable, depending on what your future needs are going to be. So let's go back to this other example, some anchors. So anchors have a lot of special pseudo classes as well. I'm sure you've noticed that when you click on links, you're browsing around, they sometimes change colors in your browser. So not every website has to code that individually. Those are pseudo classes. So I'm going to set a visited. Make that green. So now we've got our normal blue link to google.com. I will click the link, takes me to Google, great. If I go back, now the link is green because now google.com is in my browser history. They know that the destination of this link is a place I was just at recently. I have clicked on this link. And so it gets this pseudo class :visited that lets me style it differently. There's a bunch of other pseudo classes, but there's only one more that I want to show you today because I actually use this quite a bit. So for inputs, you're going to use this for building forms, just letting users type in data that you send to your server. And then oftentimes you'll want to apply special styles to the input while the user is typing in it. So that's known as focusing an input. So if we write styles for input focus, set that to color, it's gray. So now I've got my input. While I'm typing into it, you can see that my text is gray because the input is focused. But when I click away from it, it loses that pseudo class. So it only has the :focus pseudo class applied to it while I'm focused on it. So another way that you can see this is you notice the blue bar that appears around the input. By default, when you focus an element, when you focus an input element, it gets that blue border around it. That's just the default browser style. I have not overridden it, and that's pretty common, I think, for a lot of other websites you might use. So clicking on an input, this is focusing it. When you click away from it, that is blurring the input. I think it's kind of a strange terminology for it, but that's what it's called. Blur is just the opposite of focus for an input. So this is relevant when we start talking about event handling later. You're going to want to do things when someone clicks into an input and when they click out of an input. So I'm just telling you right now, when you click away from an input, when you unfocus it, that's called blurring. So focused, unfocused is blurred. We no longer have the :focus pseudo class. So that changes the styles. Okay, just one last pseudo class for inputs, because I think this is really cool. You can define valid or invalid input data for input elements. So there are a lot of ways you can customize this. That can be like a very powerful feature. But for the simplest case, just by adding a type to the input, this is going to add some very basic validation to this input to make sure that an email address is actually what gets typed in here. But then if I want the page to actually respond to what gets typed in, we can say input invalid, color red. So if you type something into the input that is not what it's supposed to have, it invalidates it, it goes against this type, then it's going to apply this pseudo class. So I'm typing here, just the word typing, it prints in red because as far as my browser is concerned, this is not an email address. If I say typing at here, this passes the validation because the built-in browser validation is honestly not super sophisticated. As long as there's a string with an @ in the middle, your browser will say that that's a valid email address. So for a practical real life application, I would probably want to override the browser's default behavior of what is valid and what is invalid. I would write my own validation functions, but I would still use these pseudo classes so that whenever the input is valid, however I've defined it, it gets one set of styles, and whenever it is invalid, however I define that, it gets some other set of styles. So yeah, you can see as I'm typing, it goes from red to green because it removes the invalid pseudo class and then applies the valid pseudo class once it becomes a valid email address because I've got that @ in the middle. So that's important for like making accessible forms that are easy for users to fill out. I think web accessibility is pretty important, and there's a lot of like important things you can do just in JavaScript or just in HTML and CSS without using JavaScript. So I try to point out those little things as they come up. All right, so that is actually all of the content that I have for you today. That is intermediate CSS. I know it's kind of a lot to take in, but I mean, now you know CSS. I feel like there's a lot of other properties out there that you don't necessarily need to focus on. If you just become an expert at the things that I told you today, you'll be really powerful, really flexible as front-end designers, I think. Jesse, was there a question?
Yeah, on the inputs, are they treated like classes or like divs when you're kind of, if you want to manipulate the border and everything?
You're asking if I can just be like,
Yeah, I was just seeing if I could do the same thing like you were doing with the other stuff.
yeah. A good question though, because in general, I'd say inputs are a little bit harder to style than like a generic div or other just generic boxy HTML elements. So some styles, like apparently the border worked, some styles you try to apply to an input won't work the way you expect them to. So you might have to get creative. Yeah, it's a good thing to be curious about.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? No more questions. I know a lot of this is, you might not even know what to ask. You just have to kind of practice with it and see what's easy for you, what's hard, because CSS is kind of finicky. It's definitely not what it seems all the time. So you really just got to get your hands dirty and see what you can do. So tonight we've actually got an assignment for you that is basically just that, get your hands dirty and see what you can do. We're going to ask you to recreate your LinkedIn profile. So you should have a pretty clear goal here. Just, take a screenshot of your LinkedIn profile and then design a website that looks like the picture, which is a pretty common use case. I've been asked to do that a lot as a developer. Just people give me a picture and they say, make the website look like this. So I think it's good if you're able to do that. But we're not telling you exactly how to do it, what CSS properties you have to use. You'll probably prefer using the ones I taught you today, but you might find other approaches that are useful to you. Just whatever you can do to make it look how it's supposed to look. Also, today is a pair programming day. So I wanted to talk a little bit, get your opinions if people want to do pair programming a little bit differently, maybe. So we could just do, the normal flow we've been doing before, just random partners for everyone, and you switch off throughout the day. But we've been hearing some people say that they might enjoy doing mixed skill pairings, like they don't enjoy it when, a beginner is paired with a beginner, or someone who's really advanced is paired with someone really advanced. They would rather have kind of a mixed skill pairing so that there's more knowledge transfer, people get that experience at least. And also, I think a lot of people wanted to choose if they were going to be a driver or a navigator and feel like they didn't get to do their preferred role for as long as they would like. So here's what I'm thinking. Let me know if this sounds like something we would want to try, or if we want to just do things the regular way. I'm not going to assign pairs. Instead, I'll just open up all the breakout rooms. And if you think that you are particularly advanced and you would like to be a navigator and explain your thought process to your driver and what strategy you should take, but not actually have your hands on the keyboard, then just join an empty breakout room. If you are a little bit less confident in your abilities and you want to get more of the muscle memory, hands-on experience of typing on the keyboard, and you want to have a navigator kind of helping you out, giving you clues about the strategy to take, what approach to take, then just join a breakout room that already has a navigator in it, and you can be their driver. And so in this way, we can kind of self-identify which role, which skill level we think we are, and kind of mix up the pairs in maybe a way that meets people's needs a little bit better. So what do people think? Does that sound like something we want to try? Or would you rather just have assigned pairs like normal?
I think it's worth a try.
Do it. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Worth a try. All right. Okay. So let's do that this weekend. Or I'm sorry, let's do that this afternoon. Not going to assign pairs. We're going to just open up the breakout rooms. If you think you're advanced, you want to be a leader, you want to navigate, meaning you're not going to have your hands on the keyboard, just join an empty breakout room. And if you would like to be navigated, if you would like to be the driver who's actually typing things out with your hands, practicing the syntax and everything, join a room with one person in it, and then you can be the driver for that navigator. Odds are there's going to be an unequal number of drivers and navigators. So if you notice you want to be a navigator, but there's still a bunch of open rooms, maybe you should be flexible to try to be a driver. If you're looking for a navigator to join, but there aren't any open, maybe you should step up and be a navigator, because it seems like we don't have enough. So there might be a little bit of flexibility on everyone's part required, but I'm hoping that this will help people to choose a role that's more useful for their development, for where they're at currently in their learning journey. I think if I'm forgetting something. Don't have any other activities this afternoon. Kat, question?
I just want to make a quick announcement because in case Slack is still down for people, Courtney and I are planning to host the first social event on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Time. So we just wanted to give people a heads up because we know people might plan stuff for the afternoons.
All right, thanks.
Hey, Raphael, I hate to keep beating the point. I still don't have a grade for assessment 1.
Yep. Those will be sent out today.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. I'm sorry, Kat, I might have missed part of what you were saying. Could you repeat your announcement?
Oh yeah, it's just for the social committee. We're planning on having the first event on this Friday at 3 p.m. Central Time. So we just wanted to give people a heads up about it.
Okay, cool. Sounds like fun stuff. Look forward to seeing it. So yeah, I don't think that we have any other activities planned for this afternoon. Just work on your exercise, work on the career prep interview questions we talked about this morning, setting up your LinkedIn profile. And other than that, we're just going to be working this afternoon. So take care. Have fun, everybody.